She was humiliated and forced out of her seat, but just minutes later, the same flight attendant who shamed her was facing consequences no one could have predicted. What happened during this flight would change everything, not just for the people on board, but for the entire airline. Before we start, let us know in the comments where you're watching from today. And if you enjoy stories like this, make sure to like, share, and subscribe for more. Ava Carter stepped onto the airplane with a calm confidence that turned a few heads. She wore a tailored blazer over a sleek dress, her natural curls framing her face. In one hand she held a leather laptop bag, and in the other, her boarding pass. She made her way down the aisle, glancing at the seat numbers as she passed. Ava's demeanor was calm and composed, but there was a quiet determination in her eyes that hinted she was someone who wasn't easily rattled. As she reached her assigned seat in the first-class section, she smiled politely at the passenger next to her and placed her bag in the overhead compartment. She sat down, pulling out a small notebook and pen, and started jotting down a few notes. Her focus was entirely on her task, oblivious to the curious glances she occasionally received from others around her. Moments later, Miranda Scott, one of the flight attendants, walked briskly through the cabin. Miranda, in her crisp uniform, had a sharp gaze that seemed to inspect every passenger she passed. Her eyes landed on Ava, and she paused. Something about Ava caught her attention, though it wasn't immediately clear what. Miranda's expression tightened, and she walked closer, stopping just beside Ava's seat. "Excuse me," Miranda said in a tone that was polite, but carried an edge. "Can I see your boarding pass, please?" Ava looked up, surprised but unfazed. She handed over her boarding pass with a small smile. "Of course." Miranda scanned the ticket and frowned slightly. "This is for first class?" "Yes," Ava said simply, her voice steady. "That's correct." Miranda's frown deepened as if she were trying to reconcile something in her mind. After a brief pause, she handed the boarding pass back without another word. Her lips pressed into a tight line as she walked away, but her demeanor suggested she wasn't done yet. Ava, meanwhile, shrugged off the interaction. She returned to her notes, her pen moving steadily across the paper. She didn't notice Miranda speaking quietly with another flight attendant near the galley, casting glances back in her direction. The tension in Miranda's face was clear, even from afar. It wasn't long before Miranda returned, this time with a more authoritative air. "Miss Carter, could you step aside for a moment? I need to verify something." Ava blinked, surprised but calm. She stood, taking her laptop bag with her, and followed Miranda toward the galley. Passengers in first class exchanged curious looks, whispering among themselves. Ava's poise remained intact as she stood in the narrow space, waiting for Miranda to speak. "I'm going to have to ask you to move to a different seat," Miranda said, folding her arms. "It seems there may have been a mistake with your booking." Ava tilted her head slightly, her brow furrowing. "A mistake? I don't think so. I booked this ticket weeks ago, and it was confirmed. Could you double-check?" Miranda's tone turned colder. "I already checked. I don't think this seat is appropriate for you. I'll have to ask you to take a seat in the main cabin." The words hung in the air, and for the first time Ava's expression shifted. A flicker of something, disbelief, annoyance, crossed her face, but she quickly regained her composure. "I don't understand. My ticket is valid. Why would I need to move?" Miranda stiffened, her voice dropping to a harsher whisper. "I don't have time to explain. Either you move or I'll have to call security to assist." Ava's eyes narrowed slightly, but she nodded once, quietly returning to her seat to gather her belongings. The entire cabin seemed to be watching now, the murmurs growing louder. As Ava walked toward the back of the plane, escorted by Miranda, she could feel the stares of other passengers following her. She kept her head high, but her grip on her laptop bag tightened ever so slightly. When they reached the main cabin, Miranda gestured toward an empty seat in the middle row. Ava placed her bag under the seat and sat down without a word. Miranda walked away, leaving Ava to settle into her new, cramped spot. Ava looked out the window, her face calm, but her thoughts were clearly racing. Somewhere between frustration and disbelief, Ava reached into her bag and pulled out her phone. Her fingers moved swiftly across the screen as she typed a message. When she hit send, a small, knowing smile tugged at the corners of her lips. Ava sat quietly in her new seat, her expression unreadable. The hum of the airplane engines filled the cabin, but the tension around her was palpable. A few passengers cast sympathetic glances in her direction, while others quickly averted their eyes, pretending not to notice the awkward situation. Ava ignored them all, her focus entirely on her phone. She scrolled through her contacts and made a quick call, keeping her voice low but firm. "Hello, it's me," she began. "I need a favor. Something happened and I'd like it addressed immediately. Yes, I'm still on the plane. No need to escalate yet. Just watch for my signal." She ended the call as quickly as she had started it, slipping the phone back into her bag. Her calmness was unnerving, almost as if she knew something no one else did. Back in first class, Miranda was moving through her duties with a sense of satisfaction. She checked on other passengers, flashing polite smiles and ensuring drinks were served. Yet her thoughts kept drifting back to Ava. There was something about her composure that had unsettled Miranda, though she couldn't quite put her finger on it. As far as Miranda was concerned, she had dealt with the situation appropriately. Still, a nagging doubt lingered in the back of her mind. Meanwhile, Ava glanced at the flight attendant assigned to the main cabin, a younger woman named Clara. Unlike Miranda, Clara seemed more empathetic. She approached Ava cautiously, holding a cup of water. "Ma'am, is everything okay?" Clara asked softly, her eyes filled with concern. Ava looked up, her smile warm but brief. "I'm fine, thank you. Just a bit of a mix-up, I suppose." Clara hesitated, clearly sensing there was more to the story, but Ava's composed demeanor discouraged further probing. "Let me know if you need anything," Clara said, placing the water on Ava's tray before stepping away. As the flight continued, Miranda remained unaware of the ripple effect her actions had set into motion. Ava, on the other hand, was entirely in control of the situation. She leaned back in her seat, watching the clouds outside the window, her fingers tapping rhythmically on her armrest. Her calm exterior concealed the storm brewing just beneath the surface. Ava wasn't the kind of person to let something like this slide. But she also wasn't one to lose her temper. She preferred precision over chaos, and she had already set her plan into motion. 7 minutes passed before a voice crackled over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, we'd like to thank you for flying with us today. We hope you're enjoying your flight. If there's anything you need, don't hesitate to let one of our crew members know." Ava's eyes flicked toward the front of the plane, her expression unreadable. She pulled out her notebook again, jotting down a single line before closing it with a decisive snap. Whatever her next move was, it was clear she was prepared for it. The cabin settled into a quiet rhythm, with passengers engrossed in their books, movies, or quiet conversations. Ava remained still in her seat, her expression calm but with an intensity that hinted at something brewing beneath the surface. Miranda, however, seemed more at ease, moving through her routine with practiced efficiency. She glanced at the first-class section as she handed out drinks, feeling a small sense of victory. To her, the issue had been resolved, and any discomfort it caused was now in the past. But the past was far from forgotten. Ava leaned slightly forward in her seat and unlocked her phone again. Her fingers hovered over the screen before typing a short, cryptic message. "They'll call soon. Let me know when it's done." She hit send, the faint glow of the phone lighting up her composed face. The message went unnoticed by the surrounding passengers, who were either distracted or disinterested. Ava's lips curved into a subtle smile, but her eyes carried a sharpness that Miranda would have found unsettling if she had noticed. At the front of the plane, Miranda approached the galley and exchanged a few words with another flight attendant, Dennis. Dennis, older and more seasoned, had been with the airline for years and often acted as a mentor to younger crew members. Miranda leaned in, her voice low. "Did you see that woman earlier?" she asked, glancing subtly in Ava's direction. Dennis raised an eyebrow. "Which one?" The one I moved to economy, Miranda clarified. She had a ticket for first class, but something about her didn't sit right with me. She looked out of place. Dennis frowned, leaning against the counter. Out of place, what do you mean? Miranda hesitated, realizing she had to tread carefully. I mean, I had a gut feeling. It's better to be cautious than sorry, right? Dennis's frown deepened. A gut feeling doesn't mean you can bump someone without cause. Did she do anything wrong? No, but Dennis cut her off with a sharp look. You'd better hope this doesn't come back to bite you, Miranda. First-class passengers don't take kindly to being moved, and neither does the airline. Miranda opened her mouth to respond, but before she could, the in-flight phone in the galley buzzed. Dennis picked it up, his expression neutral as he listened. A moment later, his brow furrowed, and he glanced at Miranda with a mix of curiosity and concern. It's for you, he said, handing her the phone. They're asking for you by name. Miranda's heart skipped a beat. She hesitated before taking the phone, her fingers tightening around the receiver. This is Miranda, she said cautiously. The voice on the other end was calm but firm. This is the airline's executive office. We've received a direct complaint about an incident involving a first-class passenger. We'll need you to provide a detailed report upon landing. For now, ensure all passengers are treated respectfully, and refrain from further altering seating arrangements without proper justification. Miranda's face paled slightly as the weight of the words sank in. Yes, of course, she stammered. I'll make sure everything is handled appropriately. As she hung up, her hand trembled slightly. Dennis watched her closely, his expression unreadable. What's going on? Nothing, Miranda muttered, but the nervous edge in her voice betrayed her. She glanced toward the main cabin where Ava sat, her calm figure now taking on an entirely new meaning. For the first time, Miranda felt a flicker of unease. Ava, seated quietly with her notebook closed on her lap, seemed oblivious to the phone call. But as Miranda returned to her duties, Ava's lips curved into the faintest smile. She had just started turning the tide, and Miranda was only beginning to realize the storm headed her way. Miranda tried to shake off her unease as she moved through the cabin, but the phone call lingered in her mind like a shadow. She forced herself to focus, smiling at passengers and performing her duties with robotic precision. Yet, her gaze kept drifting toward Ava, who sat quietly in the main cabin, unbothered and calm. It was unsettling, the way Ava seemed so composed, as if she knew something Miranda didn't. Meanwhile, Ava sat back in her seat, occasionally glancing at her watch. She crossed her legs and picked up the in-flight magazine, flipping through it absent-mindedly. To anyone watching, she looked relaxed, as though nothing about her day had been disrupted. But inside her mind, every step of her plan was unfolding exactly as she had intended. The flight attendant Clara approached Ava again, her kind demeanor a stark contrast to Miranda's earlier hostility. "Excuse me, ma'am," Clara said softly. "Would you like anything to drink? Maybe a snack?" Ava looked up, offering a polite smile. "Just water, please." Clara nodded and returned moments later with a cup of water and a small napkin. She placed them gently on Ava's tray table. "If there's anything else you need, let me know," she added kindly. Ava's eyes softened. "Thank you, Clara," she said, glancing at her name tag. Her tone was warm and her gratitude genuine. Clara gave a small smile and walked away, leaving Ava to her thoughts. Miranda watched the exchange from afar, her unease growing. The way Ava interacted with Clara, so poised and polite, it didn't match the narrative Miranda had built in her mind. It bothered her more than she cared to admit. She felt an inexplicable urge to reassert control over the situation. But she knew she had to tread carefully now. The call from the executive office had made that clear. As the plane cruised at 30,000 feet, the hum of the engines provided a steady backdrop to the tension building in Miranda's chest. She made her way to the galley again, where Dennis was busy preparing the next round of refreshments. "Everything okay?" Dennis asked, glancing at her. Miranda hesitated, then nodded. "Yeah, fine," she said curtly. But Dennis wasn't convinced. He leaned closer, his voice low. "Look, whatever's going on, you'd better hope you didn't mess with the wrong passenger. First class isn't for amateurs, Miranda. These people have connections." Miranda stiffened at his words but said nothing. Instead, she busied herself with arranging cups, though her mind was far from the task. Dennis's warning had struck a nerve. Who was Ava Carter, really? And why did she feel like she had misjudged her? At the same time, Ava's phone buzzed quietly in her lap. She glanced down at the screen, her expression unreadable. The message was short. "All set. They're monitoring." Ava slid the phone back into her bag without a word, and took a sip of water. Her movements were deliberate, calm, and unhurried, as if she had all the time in the world. The subtle tension between Ava and Miranda wasn't lost on a few observant passengers. A man across the aisle from Ava leaned over slightly and whispered, "That flight attendant has been giving you a hard time, hasn't she?" Ava looked at him, her expression neutral. "It's nothing I can't handle," she replied softly. The man raised an eyebrow, sensing there was more to the story. But he didn't push further. Ava turned her gaze back to the window, watching the endless stretch of clouds. Her calm exterior masked the quiet satisfaction she felt. The gears were turning, and Miranda had no idea how far-reaching the consequences of her actions would be. Back in the first-class section, Miranda felt her unease deepen. Every passing minute seemed to stretch endlessly, the weight of the earlier phone call pressing on her. She couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to happen, something she wouldn't be able to control. The atmosphere in the cabin grew heavier with each passing minute, though the plane itself remained steady in its flight. Miranda's movements were more rigid now, her once confident stride replaced with nervous glances. She tried to keep herself busy, checking seatbelts and distributing drinks, but her mind kept returning to Ava. Every time Miranda glanced toward the main cabin, Ava seemed as calm as ever, sitting with an air of quiet authority that Miranda found unnerving. Ava, meanwhile, appeared unbothered. She continued to gaze out of the window, occasionally jotting something down in her notebook. Her actions seemed so mundane, yet there was an undercurrent of purpose to everything she did. Passengers seated nearby couldn't help but notice her composure, contrasting sharply with Miranda's growing unease. Whispers began circulating among them, though no one dared to speak openly about the tension. Miranda's discomfort reached a breaking point when Dennis approached her in the galley again. He handed her a folded note, his expression unreadable. "The captain wants to see you," he said quietly. "What? Why?" Miranda asked, her voice sharper than intended. Dennis shrugged, though there was a faint edge of disapproval in his gaze. "He didn't say. Just go." Reluctantly, Miranda made her way toward the cockpit. As she stepped in, the door closed behind her, sealing her off from the cabin. Captain Harris, a middle-aged man with a calm yet authoritative demeanor, turned to face her. His co-pilot glanced briefly at her before returning his attention to the controls. "Miranda," Captain Harris began, his tone measured, "we've received another call from the executive office." Miranda's heart sank. "Sir, The captain held up a hand, cutting her off. "This is serious. The passenger you moved, Miss Ava Carter, is not just any passenger. She's connected to the airline's board of directors. We're under direct orders to ensure she's treated with the utmost respect for the remainder of the flight." Miranda's mouth went dry. "I didn't know," she stammered. "I thought—" "Did you think?" Captain Harris interrupted, his voice growing firmer. "Or did you assume? Because from where I'm sitting it looks like you acted without cause. That's unacceptable." Miranda opened her mouth to defend herself, but no words came. The captain sighed, rubbing his temples. "Here's what's going to happen. You'll return to your duties and ensure there are no further incidents. When we land, you'll provide a full report to the ground team. Until then, do not approach Miss Carter unless absolutely necessary. Is that clear?" "Yes, sir," Miranda whispered, her cheeks burning with embarrassment. The The captain nodded toward the door. Dismissed. Miranda left the cockpit, her mind racing. She returned to the galley where Dennis gave her a questioning look. She ignored him, instead grabbing a tray of drinks and forcing herself to move through the cabin. Her hands trembled slightly as she poured coffee for a passenger in first class, spilling a few drops onto the tray. She cursed under her breath, quickly wiping it away. Back in the main cabin, Ava remained undisturbed, her every action deliberate and measured. As Miranda passed by, Ava glanced up briefly, her eyes locking with Miranda's for a split second. There was no malice in her gaze, only an unsettling calmness, as if she knew exactly how this would end. Miranda quickened her pace, retreating to the galley once more. For the first time in her career, she felt completely out of control. And she hated it. But deep down, she couldn't shake the feeling that she had just made the biggest mistake of her life. Miranda's steps faltered as she returned to the galley, her breathing uneven. She tried to focus on the tasks at hand, but the captain's words echoed in her mind. She's connected to the board. The phrase hit her like a punch to the gut. How could she have overlooked something so important? Miranda prided herself on her instincts, but now those same instincts seemed to have betrayed her. She leaned against the counter, her hands gripping the edge tightly. Dennis watched her from the corner of his eye as he finished arranging the snack cart. "Are you going to tell me what's going on?" he asked, his tone cautious but curious. Miranda hesitated, debating whether to confide in him. Finally she sighed, her voice low. "The woman I move, she has ties to the board. The captain just told me." Dennis straightened, his expression shifting from mild curiosity to alarm. "The board? Are you serious?" Miranda nodded, her face pale. "I had no idea. I don't know what I thought. She just didn't seem like..." She stopped herself, realizing how her words sounded. Dennis crossed his arms, his tone sharp. "She didn't seem like what, Miranda? Like someone who belongs in first class?" Miranda didn't answer. She couldn't. Instead, she turned away, pretending to busy herself with the inventory. Dennis shook his head, a mix of disbelief and disappointment flashing across his face. Meanwhile, in the main cabin, Ava glanced at her watch again. The flight was nearing its halfway point, but she showed no signs of impatience. She reached into her bag and pulled out her phone, sending another brief message. Almost time. Sliding the phone back into her bag, she leaned back in her seat, her calm demeanor unshaken. The passengers around her were growing more curious. The man across the aisle who had spoken to her earlier leaned forward slightly, his voice barely above a whisper. "Are you sure you're okay? That flight attendant looked pretty rattled earlier." Ava smiled faintly, her tone polite but firm. "I appreciate your concern, but everything is under control." The man nodded, though he seemed skeptical. Ava's confidence was undeniable, and it left him wondering if there was more to her than met the eye. At the front of the plane, Miranda tried to regain her composure. She moved through the first-class cabin, checking on passengers, her smile forced and brittle. But she couldn't stop her mind from racing. The idea that Ava had connections to the airline's board was bad enough, but the way Ava had handled the entire situation so far made Miranda uneasy. Ava had never raised her voice, never lost her composure. That kind of restraint was rare and powerful. As Miranda returned to the galley to prepare for the next round of service, a chime echoed through the cabin, signaling an incoming announcement. The captain's voice came over the intercom, calm and professional. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. We'd like to thank you for choosing to fly with us today. Our flight is progressing smoothly, and we're on schedule for an on-time arrival. Please continue to enjoy your flight, and as always, don't hesitate to let our crew know if you need anything." The announcement was routine, but Miranda felt every word like a reminder of her growing mistakes. She glanced toward the main cabin again, her eyes landing on Ava. To her surprise, Ava met her gaze briefly, offering a small, almost imperceptible nod. It wasn't smug or confrontational, just calm, confident acknowledgement. That single gesture sent a shiver down Miranda's spine. Whatever Ava Carter was planning, Miranda was starting to realize she was completely unprepared for it. The hum of the airplane engines filled the cabin as the flight continued, but the tension between Miranda and Ava was impossible to ignore. Miranda tried to focus on her duties, but her every action felt mechanical, her mind clouded by unease. She avoided looking toward the main cabin, yet she couldn't help but feel the weight of Ava's presence, as if the calm young woman was silently orchestrating something just out of sight. In the main cabin, Ava remained a picture of composure. She glanced at her watch, then at the small screen in front of her seat displaying the flight's progress. A faint smile crossed her lips, but it vanished just as quickly. She leaned forward slightly, pulled out her notebook, and began to write again. Her handwriting was neat and deliberate, every word carefully chosen. To an onlooker, it would have seemed like a mundane moment, but for Ava, every detail mattered. Meanwhile, Miranda's discomfort deepened. She returned to the galley and leaned against the counter, her arms crossed tightly. Dennis, who had been observing her for most of the flight, finally decided to speak up. "You've been tense ever since that phone call," he said, his tone low but firm. "What's really going on?" Miranda hesitated, her eyes darting toward the curtain that separated the galley from the main cabin. "I told you already," she muttered. "The passenger I moved has connections, important ones." Dennis raised an eyebrow. "Important enough for the captain to get involved? That's not just connections, Miranda. That's a warning. What did you do to her?" "I didn't do anything," Miranda snapped, though the defensive edge in her voice betrayed her. "She didn't belong in first class, and You assumed she didn't belong," Dennis interrupted, his voice sharp. "And now you're paying for it. Look, I've been with this airline for years. If you crossed someone with real power, you'd better brace yourself. People like that don't let things slide." Miranda clenched her jaw, her frustration bubbling over. What was I supposed to do? She didn't seem like... Like what? Dennis cut in again. Like someone rich enough to sit in first class? Like someone who could afford to fly like the rest of the passengers up there? Miranda fell silent, her hands gripping the counter so tightly her knuckles turned white. Dennis shook his head, sighing heavily. "You should have left her alone. Now you've made a mess that's way bigger than you realize." As Dennis returned to his duties, Miranda felt a wave of panic wash over her. She knew he was right, but it was too late to undo her actions. She glanced toward the main cabin again, her heart pounding. Ava was still seated calmly, her notebook now closed and tucked away. The faint smile on her face was gone, replaced by an expression of quiet resolve. Just then, a chime echoed through the cabin. Miranda's heart skipped a beat, but it was only the signal for an incoming call to the galley phone. She reached for it, her hands trembling slightly. "Galley, this is Miranda," she said, trying to keep her voice steady. "This is the captain," came the voice on the other end. "We've received another communication from the executive office. They've requested that Miss Carter be given full priority service for the remainder of the flight. Make sure she's comfortable, and personally apologize for any earlier inconvenience." Miranda's breath caught in her throat. "Yes, sir," she managed to say before hanging up. She stood frozen for a moment, the weight of the situation pressing down on her. The request wasn't just a suggestion. It was a direct order, one she couldn't ignore. Summoning what little composure she had left, Miranda prepared herself to approach Ava again. This time she knew the power dynamic had shifted completely. Whatever happened next, Miranda could feel that her role in the unfolding story was no longer in her control. Miranda stepped out of the galley, clutching a glass of sparkling water on a tray with trembling hands. Her usual poise had vanished, replaced with visible tension as she made her way toward the main cabin. Each step felt heavier than the last, the weight of her earlier decisions pressing down on her like an anchor. She knew this wasn't just about delivering water. It was an unspoken acknowledgement that she had crossed a line. When she reached Ava's seat, she hesitated, the tray trembling slightly in her grip. Ava looked up, her expression calm and unreadable. The air between them seemed to thicken as Miranda forced a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Miss Carter," Miranda began, her voice softer than anyone on the flight had heard it before. "I wanted to personally apologize for any inconvenience you may have experienced earlier. It was a misunderstanding on my part." Ava tilted her head slightly, her gaze sharp but composed. "A misunderstanding," she repeated, her voice quiet but firm. Miranda's forced smile faltered. "Yes, I didn't mean to disrupt your experience. Please accept this as a token of apology." She placed the glass of sparkling water on Ava's tray table with a slightly shaky hand. Ava regarded the glass for a moment before looking back at Miranda. "Thank you," she said simply, her tone neutral. "But I think it's going to take more than a drink to fix this." The words, though spoken softly, hit Miranda like a slap. She swallowed hard, her palms beginning to sweat. "Of course," Miranda stammered. "If there's anything else I can do to make this right, please let me know." Ava didn't respond immediately. Instead, she leaned back in her seat, studying Miranda as if weighing her next move. The silence stretched just long enough to make Miranda fidget uncomfortably. Finally, Ava smiled faintly. Not one of satisfaction, but one of calm confidence. "I appreciate your effort," Ava said finally. "But I believe the airline will address this matter appropriately after we land." Miranda's stomach sank. The mention of the airline was a clear signal that Ava wasn't letting the incident go. I understand," Miranda murmured, lowering her eyes. "If you need anything else, don't hesitate to ask." Without waiting for a reply, Miranda turned and walked back to the galley as quickly as she could without running. Her cheeks burned with humiliation, and her mind raced with the implications of Ava's words. It was clear that the situation was far from resolved, and whatever was coming next was entirely out of her control. Ava, meanwhile, picked up the glass of sparkling water and took a small sip. She set it down carefully, her expression betraying nothing. To the passengers around her, she appeared as calm and composed as ever. But inside, Ava knew the game was shifting entirely in her favor. Back in the galley, Dennis raised an eyebrow as Miranda slumped against the counter, her face pale. "How did it go?" he asked. Miranda shook her head, her voice barely above a whisper. "She's not done. She's going to take this all the way." Dennis sighed, his expression grim. "I told you. People like her. They don't play games. You should have known better." Miranda didn't respond. Instead, she stared at the curtain separating the galley from the main cabin, her mind spinning. For the first time, she realized that Ava Carter wasn't just another passenger. She was someone who wielded far more power than Miranda had ever imagined. And now, she was paying the price for underestimating her. Miranda remained in the galley, her thoughts spiraling as she replayed the events of the flight. She had never felt so small, so exposed, in her years of working with the airline. Dennis moved quietly around her, occasionally throwing her a concerned glance, but saying nothing. It was clear that he knew the gravity of the situation, and that Miranda was completely out of her depth. Meanwhile, in the main cabin, Ava closed her notebook and placed it back in her bag with deliberate care. She adjusted her posture, sitting tall and composed, as if she were preparing for something. The faint hum of whispered conversations around her reached her ears, but she paid them no mind. Her focus was unshaken, her every move precise. Not long after, the intercom chimed again. This time, the captain's voice carried a distinct air of authority. "Ladies and gentlemen, we'll be beginning our descent shortly. Please ensure your seatbelts are fastened and your trays are in their upright positions. Cabin crew, prepare for landing." The announcement brought a flurry of activity as passengers adjusted their seats and secured their belongings. Clara, the attentive flight attendant from earlier, returned to Ava's row. She offered a warm smile, though there was a hint of unease in her eyes. "Is there anything I can get you before we land, Miss Carter?" Ava shook her head politely. "Thank you, Clara. You've been very kind." Clara's cheeks flushed slightly at the compliment. "If there's anything you need, please don't hesitate to ask," she said, before stepping away to continue her duties. Ava's calm tone had reassured her. but the tension in the cabin was impossible to ignore. In the first-class section, Miranda busied herself with the final checks before landing, her movements stiff and mechanical. She tried to keep her expression neutral, but her mind was a storm of anxiety. The captain's earlier directive and Ava's subtle but powerful words replayed in her head like a haunting refrain. She could feel the eyes of Dennis and the other flight attendants on her, though no one said a word. As the plane descended through the clouds, Ava glanced out the window, watching the cityscape of their destination come into view. Her fingers rested lightly on the armrest, her demeanor as poised as ever. Despite the chaos Miranda was experiencing, Ava felt entirely in control. Every step of the journey had unfolded just as she had anticipated, and she was ready for what came next. When the plane touched down with a smooth landing, a collective sigh of relief swept through the cabin. Passengers began unbuckling their seatbelts and retrieving their belongings from the overhead compartments. The usual rustling and chatter filled the air, but an undercurrent of tension lingered, especially for Miranda, who was acutely aware of Ava's presence and the looming repercussions of her actions. As the seatbelt sign turned off, Ava remained seated, her movements unhurried. She reached into her bag and pulled out her phone again, typing a quick message. "We've landed. Be ready." She slipped the phone back into her bag and glanced toward the front of the plane, where Miranda was stationed near the exit. Their eyes met briefly and Miranda's stomach twisted. The cabin doors opened and the cool air of the jet bridge began to flow into the plane. Passengers filed out in an orderly manner, the murmurs of casual conversation blending with the clinking of luggage handles. Miranda stood stiffly, forcing a smile for each passenger who passed. But her heart raced as she waited for Ava to approach. Ava didn't rush to join the line. Instead, she waited until the aisle was nearly empty before standing, gathering her things with the same calm precision she had shown throughout the flight. As she walked toward the exit, the remaining crew, including Clara and Dennis, exchanged subtle glances. Everyone seemed to sense that something significant was about to happen. When Ava reached the exit, Miranda straightened, forcing herself to meet Ava's gaze. "Thank you for flying with us, Miss Carter," Miranda said, her voice faltering slightly. Ava paused, her expression neutral but her eyes sharp. "I'm sure we'll be in touch," she replied smoothly, her tone carrying a weight that sent a chill down Miranda's spine. Without another word, Ava stepped off the plane, leaving Miranda frozen in place. Dennis approached her cautiously. "You okay?" he asked, though his tone suggested he already knew the answer. Miranda didn't respond. Her eyes remained fixed on the open door, as if expecting something, or someone, to appear. And she wasn't wrong. Moments later, two uniformed security officers stepped onto the plane, their presence commanding immediate attention. They scanned the cabin before focusing on Miranda. "Are you Miranda Scott?" one of them asked. Miranda's breath caught. "Yes," she managed to say, her voice barely above a whisper. "We need you to come with us," the officer said firmly. "We have some questions regarding an incident on this flight." The color drained from Miranda's face as the weight of her actions finally crashed down on her. Dennis watched in silence as the officers escorted her off the plane, her stiff posture betraying her growing panic. The remaining crew exchanged uneasy glances, unsure of what would happen next. Outside in the terminal, Ava stood near the gate, her phone in hand. She watched calmly as Miranda was led away, her expression unreadable. The message she had sent earlier had done its job, and now the wheels were fully in motion. Ava turned and walked toward the baggage claim, her steps steady and purposeful. She had no need to look back. The situation was already exactly where she wanted it to be. The bustling energy of the airport terminal contrasted sharply with the stillness that had overtaken Miranda as she was escorted away by the security officers. Passengers who had shared the flight began dispersing, many throwing curious glances at the unfolding scene. Whispers filled the air, but no one approached Ava as she calmly made her way toward baggage claim. Her demeanor remained composed, but her every movement seemed deliberate, as though she was already 2 steps ahead of everyone else. At the security holding area, Miranda was seated in a small, stark room with a single table and 2 chairs. The officers who had escorted her off the plane stood near the door, their expressions professional but stern. Miranda's mind raced as she tried to piece together what had just happened. She had gone from a respected flight attendant to the subject of an investigation in what felt like mere moments. The realization hit her hard. This wasn't just a misunderstanding. It was a calculated response. One of the officers spoke, breaking the heavy silence. "Miss Scott, we've been informed of an incident involving a first-class passenger on your flight. The airline's executive team has requested a full account of your actions." Miranda swallowed hard. Her throat felt dry, and her voice wavered as she replied, I don't know what this is about. I was just doing my job." The officer raised an eyebrow. "According to the reports we've received, the passenger you removed from first class was Ava Carter. Are you aware of her position?" Miranda's heart sank further. I didn't know at first," she admitted, her voice barely audible. "I only found out during the flight." The officer leaned forward slightly, his gaze unwavering. "Miss Carter is not only a high-ranking executive affiliated with this airline but also a major shareholder. Her complaint has already reached the board, and they take allegations of bias and mistreatment very seriously." Miranda's face turned ashen. She opened her mouth to respond, but no words came out. The officer continued, his tone growing firmer. "Miss Carter's account of the events has been documented, and additional passengers have corroborated her version of the story. We're giving you the opportunity to provide your side, but let me be clear, this matter will not be taken lightly." Miranda's hands trembled as she gripped the edge of the table. She wanted to defend herself, to explain her actions, but the words felt hollow even before they formed. Deep down, she knew there was no justification that would hold up under scrutiny. She had made a snap judgment, a judgment that had cost her more than she could have imagined. Meanwhile, at baggage claim, Ava stood near the carousel, her phone pressed to her ear. Her voice was calm, but carried a note of finality. "Yes, the security team has taken her in for questioning. Make sure the board reviews the footage and statements. I want the matter resolved professionally but thoroughly." She listened for a moment, nodding slightly as the person on the other end of the call responded. "Thank you. And please send a copy of the final report to my office. I want to ensure that this never happens again. Not to me, and not to anyone else." As she ended the call, the first of the luggage began to emerge on the conveyor belt. Ava reached for her sleek black suitcase, pulling it off effortlessly. Around her, a few passengers from the flight watched her with a mixture of curiosity and newfound respect. She didn't acknowledge them, her focus entirely on her next steps. The terminal was filled with the usual chaos of arrivals and departures, but Ava moved through it with a sense of purpose. She had turned an incident of prejudice and humiliation into an opportunity for accountability and systemic change. And she wasn't done yet. Ava's quiet strength and strategic thinking had set the stage for a reckoning, one that Miranda and the airline would not soon forget. Miranda sat in the sterile room, her breathing shallow as the weight of the situation pressed down on her. The officers gave her a moment to collect herself, but the silence in the room felt suffocating. Every second that passed made it harder for her to steady her nerves. Finally, she spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "I didn't mean for this to happen," Miranda began, her eyes darting between the officers. "I was just following protocol. I thought she didn't belong in first class." The officer closest to her leaned forward, his expression unreadable. "And what exactly made you think that?" Miranda's lips parted as if to answer, but she hesitated. The truth that her assumption had been based on unconscious bias was something she couldn't bring herself to admit. I don't know," she stammered. "She didn't act like the other passengers in first class." The officer exchanged a glance with his partner before replying. "Not acting like the other passengers isn't a justification for moving someone to a different section, especially when their ticket was valid. Did she break any rules? Did she violate any airline policies?" Miranda shook her head, her palms damp with sweat. "No, but the officer cut her off. "Then you acted without cause. Miss Carter was within her rights to remain in the seat she paid for. And your actions have put the airline in a very difficult position." Miranda's heart sank as the gravity of his words settled over her. She wanted to argue, to defend herself. But the facts were undeniable. Her decision had been based on nothing more than an assumption, and now she was facing the consequences. Meanwhile, Ava had exited the terminal, and was now standing at the curb, waiting for her car. A sleek black sedan pulled up, and the driver, dressed in a sharp suit, stepped out to open the door for her. "Miss Carter," he greeted her with a respectful nod. "Everything has been arranged as per your instructions." "Thank you, William," Ava replied, sliding into the back seat with her usual grace. Once inside, she retrieved her phone and began scrolling through her emails. A notification from the airline's board caught her attention, and she opened it immediately. The email was concise but clear. It outlined the steps the board would take to address the incident, including a formal review of the airline's training policies, and an assurance that Miranda's actions would not go unchecked. Ava's lips curled into a faint smile of satisfaction. She had no interest in revenge. Her goal was accountability and change, and it seemed she was already making progress. Back at the airport, the officers had finished their questioning of Miranda. They stood preparing to leave the room, but not before delivering a final cutting statement. "This matter will be escalated to the airline's disciplinary committee," one of them said firmly. "You'll receive notification of their decision soon. In the meantime, you're suspended from duty." Miranda felt her stomach drop as the officers exited the room, leaving her alone with her thoughts. The reality of her situation was sinking in, and for the first time she realized how completely she had underestimated Ava Carter. At that very moment, Ava's car pulled smoothly away from the terminal, blending into the stream of traffic. She gazed out the window, her mind calm and clear. The day had been exhausting, but Ava felt a deep sense of satisfaction knowing that she had stood her ground, and in doing so, had paved the way for change. Her phone buzzed, breaking her reverie. It was another message from the airline's board confirming that they would be conducting a full review of the incident and implementing new sensitivity training for their staff. Ava read the message carefully before responding. "Good. Let's ensure this never happens again." As the city skyline came into view, Ava leaned back in her seat, letting out a quiet breath. This chapter was coming to a close, but she knew her actions today would have a lasting impact on the airline, and hopefully, on everyone who worked there. Miranda sat in the small room long after the officers had left, staring blankly at the table in front of her. The weight of the suspension, the looming investigation, and the sharp realization of what her actions had caused, pressed down on her like a crushing weight. She replayed every decision she had made that day, each moment unraveling her confidence further. What had seemed like an instinctual judgment earlier now felt like an irreversible mistake. Her phone buzzed, snapping her out of her spiraling thoughts. She hesitated before picking it up, knowing that whatever awaited her on the screen wouldn't be good. It was a message from the airline's Human Resources Department, curt and formal. "Miranda, please be prepared to attend a disciplinary hearing scheduled for tomorrow at 9 a.m. Further details will be provided by email." Her hand trembled as she read the message, the finality of her actions becoming clear. The hearing wasn't just a formality. It was a chance for the airline to protect its reputation. And Miranda knew she was being positioned as the scapegoat. She wanted to scream, to fight back, but deep down she knew there was nothing she could say to undo the damage. Meanwhile, Ava's car had arrived at her office, a sleek building in the heart of the city. She stepped out gracefully, her driver holding the door open for her. Inside, her assistant Maya greeted her with a smile and a stack of documents. "It's all here," Maya said, handing over a folder. The board's initial review of the incident, statements from the crew, and the planned changes to training programs. "They've moved quickly." Ava nodded, her expression thoughtful as she flipped through the documents. "They know this can't be swept under the rug," she said calmly. "They're protecting their interests, but it's a step in the right direction." Maya hesitated, then spoke carefully. "Do you think she'll fight back?" The flight attendant, I mean. Ava paused, considering the question. Maybe, she said, finally closing the folder. But this isn't about her anymore. This is about the system that allowed someone like her to feel comfortable making decisions based on prejudice. That's what needs to change. Maya nodded, her admiration for Ava evident. You've already made an impact. The board is taking this seriously because of you. Ava gave a small smile but said nothing. She knew the work wasn't done yet. Change on a systemic level required persistence and patience, and Ava had both in abundance. Back at the airport, Miranda finally stood, her legs shaky as she left the holding room. She avoided eye contact with the officers and airport staff as she made her way to the employee exit. The journey to her car felt like a walk of shame. Her uniform a stark reminder of the career that now hung by a thread. Sitting in her car, Miranda stared at the steering wheel, her mind racing. She had spent years building her reputation as a capable and dedicated flight attendant. And now, it was all unraveling. She thought about Ava, calm, composed, and untouchable. The realization struck Miranda like a blow. Ava had never lost control of the situation. She had been in charge from the moment Miranda made her first mistake. For the first time, Miranda allowed herself to feel something other than anger or frustration. A deep, gnawing regret settled in her chest. She had underestimated Ava Carter, not just as a passenger, but as a person. And now, she was paying the price. As Miranda drove away from the airport, Ava sat in her office reviewing the documents Maya had given her. Her phone buzzed again, this time with a message from the airline's CEO, requesting a personal meeting to discuss the incident and next steps. Ava typed a short reply. "I'll make time tomorrow. Let's ensure this is resolved properly." She set her phone down and leaned back in her chair, her mind already moving to the future. The events of the day had been draining, but Ava knew they had also opened a door, an opportunity to reshape the culture of an entire organization. And for Ava, that was a fight worth having. The morning sun spilled through the blinds in Ava's office, casting long shadows on her desk as she prepared for the meeting with the airline's CEO. She had spent the night reviewing documents, drafting statements, and considering the broader implications of the incident. To Ava, this wasn't just about addressing her personal experience. It was about setting a precedent that no one, regardless of their position or background, should face the kind of treatment she endured. At exactly 10 a.m., her assistant Maya escorted the CEO, Richard Hale, into the room. He was a tall, imposing man in his late 50s, with silver-streaked hair and a polished demeanor. Despite his confident exterior, there was a noticeable tension in his movements as he extended his hand to Ava. "Miss Carter, thank you for agreeing to meet on such short notice," Richard began, his tone carefully measured. Ava shook his hand, her expression calm but firm. "I appreciate you taking the situation seriously, Mr. Hale. Please have a seat." Richard sat across from her, adjusting his tie as he began to speak. "First, let me express my deepest apologies for what happened on your flight. It was completely unacceptable, and we are committed to ensuring that such incidents do not occur again." Ava nodded, her gaze unwavering. "I'm glad to hear that. However, apologies alone won't fix the underlying issues. This isn't just about one flight attendant making a poor decision. It's about the environment that allowed her to feel justified in that decision." Richard's face tightened slightly, but he nodded in agreement. "You're absolutely right. That's why we've already begun a full review of our policies and training programs. We're implementing mandatory sensitivity and bias training for all staff, and we'll be revisiting our internal reporting processes to ensure better accountability." Ava leaned back in her chair, studying him for a moment. "It's a start," she said, "but it's not enough. I want a detailed timeline for these changes, as well as regular updates on their progress. And I expect to see measurable results." Richard hesitated briefly before nodding. "Of course, we'll provide you with everything you need." Ava allowed a small smile to cross her lips. "Good. Let's make sure this becomes a turning point for your organization, not just a one-time correction." The meeting continued for another hour, with Ava laying out her expectations and Richard taking careful notes. By the time it ended, there was a clear sense of purpose in the room. As Richard stood to leave, he extended his hand again. This time there was genuine respect in his gaze. "Thank you for holding us accountable," he said. "We'll make this right." Ava shook his hand firmly. "I'll hold you to that." As Richard left, Maya entered the room, her eyes bright with curiosity. "How did it go?" Ava exhaled, a mix of relief and determination in her voice. "It went well. But this is just the beginning." While Ava's meeting was progressing, Miranda sat in a sterile conference room at the airline's headquarters, waiting for her disciplinary hearing to begin. The weight of her suspension hung over her like a dark cloud, and the silence of the room only amplified her growing anxiety. A stack of papers sat in front of her, each one detailing her actions during the flight and the subsequent complaints filed by Ava Carter. The door opened, and a panel of 3 senior airline executives entered, their expressions neutral but firm. One of them, a woman with sharp features and an air of authority, spoke first. "Miss Scott, thank you for coming. We're here to discuss the incident that occurred on Flight 287 and the allegations made against you." Miranda nodded weakly, her throat dry. "I understand," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. The executives began reviewing the timeline of events, asking Miranda to provide her account of what happened. She tried to explain her actions, but her words felt hollow, even to her own ears. "I thought she might have been in the wrong seat," Miranda said at one point, her voice faltering. "I was just trying to follow protocol." The sharp-featured executive raised an eyebrow. "Protocol?" "According to our records, Miss Carter presented a valid first-class ticket." "At what point did you verify this before asking her to move?" Miranda hesitated, her palms damp. I didn't," she admitted finally. The room fell silent, the weight of her admission hanging in the air. Another executive, a middle-aged man with glasses, leaned forward. "Miss Scott, the airline has a zero-tolerance policy for discrimination. Your actions not only violated that policy, but also jeopardized our reputation. Do you understand the severity of this situation?" Miranda nodded slowly, her heart sinking. "I do." The panel continued questioning her, their tone professional but unyielding. By the time the hearing ended, Miranda felt utterly defeated. The final decision would be communicated to her in writing, but the outcome was already clear in her mind. Her career with the airline was over. As Miranda left the room, she couldn't help but think of Ava, the composed woman who had maintained her dignity, even as Miranda stripped it away. For the first time, Miranda felt the full weight of her actions, not just their impact on her career, but on the person she had wronged. And as much as she wanted to blame the system or her instincts, she knew the truth. She had made a choice, and now she was facing the consequences. Ava sat in her office later that afternoon, sipping a cup of tea as she reviewed an email from the airline's board. The tone of the email was clear. They were eager to demonstrate their commitment to reform. Attached was a timeline of the planned changes Ava had requested, including the rollout of mandatory training programs and revisions to their complaint handling processes. It was a small but significant victory, and Ava allowed herself a moment to feel satisfaction. Her phone buzzed, pulling her attention away from the screen. It was a message from Maya. "Miranda Scott has been officially terminated. Thought you'd want to know." Ava set her cup down slowly, staring at the message. It didn't bring her joy, nor did it feel like a true resolution. Ava wasn't vindictive by nature, and she knew Miranda's dismissal was only a symptom of the larger problem. Yet, it was a necessary step, an acknowledgement that actions had consequences. She leaned back in her chair, reflecting on the whirlwind of events over the past 24 hours. Her decision to act decisively had been driven by more than just personal affront. It was about setting an example, not just for the airline, but for anyone who might find themselves in her position. Ava picked up her phone and typed a quick reply to Maya. "Thanks for letting me know. Let's keep focusing on the bigger picture." Miranda sat in her small apartment that evening, the termination notice from the airline resting on the table in front of her. She had spent hours replaying the hearing in her mind, hoping to find some justification for her actions, but there was none. The reality was stark and unavoidable. Her assumptions, rooted in prejudice, had cost her everything. Her friends and family had started to reach out, their messages filled with a mix of sympathy and judgment. Miranda couldn't bring herself to respond. She felt isolated, trapped by the weight of her mistakes. For years, she had prided herself on being a competent professional, someone who followed the rules and did her job well. But now, all of that seemed meaningless. She turned on the television, hoping to distract herself. But the first thing she saw was a news segment about bias in the workplace. It was as though the universe was determined to make her confront her actions. The segment featured a brief interview with Ava Carter, who spoke eloquently about the importance of systemic change and holding organizations accountable. Miranda stared at the screen, her chest tightening. Ava's calm demeanor and articulate words stood in stark contrast to Miranda's own turmoil. For the first time, she saw Ava not as an adversary, but as someone who had every right to demand better, for herself and for others. Turning off the TV, Miranda sat in silence. She knew she couldn't undo what she had done, but maybe, just maybe, she could learn from it. She reached for her laptop and began typing an email. It was addressed to the airline's board, but her focus wasn't on defending herself. Instead, she wrote a heartfelt apology, not just to Ava but to everyone her actions had affected. For the first time in days, Miranda felt a sliver of clarity. She couldn't change the past, but she could choose how she moved forward. The following week, Ava received an unexpected email. It was forwarded to her by the airline's board, with the subject line, "Apology from former staff." Curious, she opened it and began to read. The message was from Miranda Scott, and it started with a simple acknowledgement of her mistakes. "Miss Carter, I owe you an apology. My actions on that flight were inexcusable. I acted on assumptions rather than facts, and I failed to see you for who you are. A valued passenger and, more importantly, a person who deserved respect. My behavior reflected poorly not only on me but on the airline as a whole. For that, I am truly sorry." Ava read the email carefully, noting the tone of sincerity. Miranda went on to explain how the aftermath of the incident had forced her to reflect deeply on her actions and their consequences. She admitted to her biases and expressed her intention to educate herself and become a better person. "This experience has been humbling, and I've come to understand that the changes you are advocating for are desperately needed, not just in this airline, but everywhere. I hope my actions, though wrong, can serve as an example of what must change. I am committed to learning and to never repeating such a mistake. Thank you for holding me accountable." Ava leaned back in her chair after finishing the email, her thoughts swirling. She wasn't naive. She knew people often apologized to lessen the weight of their guilt or to salvage their reputation. But something about Miranda's words felt genuine, and Ava couldn't ignore that. She debated for a moment before drafting a brief response. "Thank you for your message. Accountability is the first step toward growth. I hope you continue on this path and use this experience to create positive change in the future." Hitting send, Ava closed her laptop and gazed out the window. For her, the incident wasn't just about personal justice. It was about creating a ripple effect. And while Miranda's apology didn't erase what had happened, it hinted at the possibility of change. It was a small step, but Ava knew that even small steps could lead to something greater. Weeks passed, and the ripple effects of the incident on Flight 287 were beginning to take hold. The airline had rolled out its first series of mandatory sensitivity and bias training sessions for all staff, a move that was announced publicly alongside a statement of accountability. Ava's role in pushing for these changes was highlighted subtly but respectfully in the announcement, positioning her not as an antagonist, but as a catalyst for progress. The changes sparked conversations across the aviation industry. Other airlines began reviewing their policies, and several reached out to Ava directly for guidance. She declined most offers, focusing instead on ensuring that her efforts with this airline were fully realized. Her work wasn't about personal accolades. It was about creating lasting impact. One afternoon, Ava found herself back at the airport, preparing to board a flight for a business meeting. As she approached the gate, she noticed a subtle shift in the way the staff interacted with passengers. Smiles were genuine, and every question was answered with patience and care. It wasn't perfect. No system ever was. But it was better, and that was a start. When Ava reached the gate, the agent recognized her immediately. "Miss Carter, welcome back. We've upgraded your seat as a token of our appreciation for your continued support," they said warmly. Ava smiled, appreciating the gesture but waving it off politely. "That's kind of you, but I'm fine where I am," she replied. Her confidence and humility combined, as always, in a way that drew respect without demanding it. As she boarded the plane, Ava noticed subtle changes in the way the crew carried themselves. They seemed more attentive, more engaged with the passengers. She took her seat, quietly observing the flow of the cabin as people settled in. Across the aisle, a young woman struggled to find space for her bag in the overhead compartment. Almost instinctively, a flight attendant stepped in to help her, their tone warm and reassuring. It reminded Ava of Clara, the one attendant during her ordeal who had shown her kindness. Ava had ensured Clara's professionalism was highlighted in her discussions with the board, and Clara had since been promoted to a senior role. Ava spotted her near the front of the cabin, supervising the boarding process with a steady, confident demeanor. Clara caught Ava's eye and smiled, a look of gratitude passing between them. Ava nodded back subtly, an unspoken acknowledgement of shared respect. It was moments like this that reminded Ava why she had pushed so hard for change. Small gestures, multiplied over time, could transform an entire culture. As the plane took off, Ava leaned back in her seat, reflecting on the journey she had taken. Not just the flight, but everything that had followed. She thought about Miranda's apology, the systemic reforms, and the messages of support she had received from strangers who had heard her story. It was humbling and empowering all at once. Somewhere in another part of the city, Miranda was also embarking on her own journey. She had taken a job with a non-profit organization dedicated to workplace diversity and inclusion, using her experience as a case study for change. It wasn't an easy path, and Miranda knew she had much to prove, but it gave her a sense of purpose she hadn't felt before. For the first time in her life, she was looking beyond herself, determined to contribute to something larger. As the plane cruised at 30,000 feet, Ava pulled out her notebook, flipping to a blank page. She wrote down a single line. "Change begins with accountability, but it thrives on persistence." Closing the notebook, she allowed herself a rare moment of peace, gazing out the window at the endless expanse of clouds. She knew the fight wasn't over. There was still so much work to do. But as she watched the sky stretch endlessly before her, Ava felt something she hadn't expected: hope. The events of that flight had been painful, but they had sparked something much bigger than her. And in that moment, Ava knew with quiet certainty that the sky was not the limit. It was just the beginning. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to hit the like button, share your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe to the channel for more stories like this. See you in the next one.